Welcome to another episode of Love is Knowledge, where we're exploring fascinating ideas and learning from exceptional individuals. Today, we're thrilled to have a remarkable guest with us. He's a professor at Chula Vista Christian University, has served as a pilot in the United States Air Force for 7 years, and is the mastermind behind the Philo Surfer YouTube channel. Please welcome philosopher Chico Jones. Chico, we're very incredibly grateful to have you here today. I reached out to you because your YouTube channel has just been such an invaluable resource for me, especially when researching the philosophy of mind as well as other philosophical ideas. And I'm just super excited to discuss some ideas with you today. On an additional note, please all show your appreciation by heading over to Chico's YouTube channel, and it will be linked in the episode description below. So let's just dive right in. So I'm incredibly fascinated by the mind-body problem. And so I just wanted to get your understanding of it and just how you characterize the problem and sort of what your stance is on it.
Okay, yeah. So mind-body problem is that there are there seem to be a big disparity between two things, the brain and the mind, right? And you can parse that out as the body versus the mind, or the brain versus the soul, or there are different ways of actually saying that. But the difference is being one seems to be we also can call it physical versus mental, by the way. But the first one seems to have properties like being third person, meaning like you perceive it in a way that you could measure it. You know, you could perceive it in a way that you can we can all see it. The second one is a first person experience where it's something you have limited access to. Like only one person has access to it. You, the person who has consciousness, who has that mind. There is sorry, I'm
It's
sorry.
fine. I think
Yeah.
what you're trying to get at is how sort of there seems to be that like difference between the mind and the body and sort of how it's you have, as you've said, the objective like physical, which is measurable, but you also sort
Mhm.
of have that subjective part like consciousness or experience, and so it's sort of hard to reconcile both of these ideas. Is that
Yeah, and there are other properties too that just seems like that make them different. So like one seems to be like located in a place. Like the brain seems to be located obviously and spatio-temporally located. The other one, it's not quite so easy to point to a thought, you know, like you could point to a neuron, but you can't like open up a brain and say, "Hey, there's that thought of a cat right there."
yeah.
There are a number of other different properties like that seem to make them different property. And then the question is, are they actually different? You know, like it seems like this would be some mysterious thing that we have no other uh, examples of in life. So how's that possible?
Mm. So you talk about the idea of sort of the mind being subjective. So I don't know if you're
Mhm.
familiar with Nagel's paper on what is it like to be a bat, where he sort of characterizes consciousness as the what is the likeness of experience or
Mhm.
sort of subjective experience. And so I just want to understand what your standpoint is on consciousness as a whole and where you think it exactly fits in within the mind body problem, and whether the way Nagel sort of characterizes it is the best way to go forward with that kind of thinking.
Yeah, his whole "what is it like" locution, I think, is been so helpful because I don't think it's something that can be defined. I think there are these things in philosophy that I think that you can only point to. You can't actually define them. Like existence is one of those things. How do you define existence without just pointing to things that exist and say, see what that thing's doing right there? Whatever that thing is doing, that's existence, right? And I think consciousness is one of those kinds of things. We can kind of get around it by saying, you know, that thing that when you taste something and it's like a grape in your mouth, that kind of thing. Um, and he really hit on something interesting when his he specifically was talking about the bat having echolocation and having an experience of echolocation. And is that something that we could actually experience? um I think I would prefer if he would use something like a duckbill platypus experiences electrical impulses and perceives the world in that way, because there are some people that are blind that can use echolocation. So I mean, if you get nitpicky, then that, but his point is made, that um and as far as consciousness goes, then and my idea of consciousness, yeah, I definitely am not a person that would deny, like I definitely think that consciousness is real. Like there's a lot, it's a big thing nowadays to say that it's an illusion, or it's something that is reducible to other things. And I find it really hard and really implausible to dismiss consciousness, when I think it's one of the I think we have more evidence for consciousness than we have that than the material world exists. Like, I know that I'm experiencing something. Do I know that? And I'm not saying that I don't believe the material world by any chance, um, but yeah, like I think I have more evidence that I'm experiencing something than that thing actually exists. Um, I do think that my experience is of the actual thing, so I don't think that I don't like really believe in like the Cartesian problem of is the real world really out there? So that's kind of a side note, though. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sort of going all over the place, man.
No, 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 that's fine. 100% agree. I feel like consciousness, like a lot of people, like illusionists, will just say, "Oh, it's just an illusion." But I feel like it's one of those things that just seems so like obvious if you really
Hmm.
think about it. Like when I first read Nagel's paper, I had no idea what the hell he was saying, but um, like reading it over again, I was like, this makes so much sense. And then moving on to, I think the next reading that I did was on Descartes' Meditations. Um, I sort of see the mind and consciousness as almost synonymous with one another. So
Hmm.
the whole thing of I think, therefore I am, like it just seems so intuitive, I feel like, to us, where
Hmm.
the mind must exist, and similarly with consciousness, and that's the thing that we can certainly be sure of. I'm not an idealist by any means, but I just really think that consciousness is very apparent, just as apparent
Hmm.
as the physical world. And so yeah. Um, Going on with that idea of consciousness, key contention around this idea has been philosophical zombies proposed by both Grippy and Chalmers. And so for the viewers, these are basically beings that are physically alike to us humans in every way possible, but lack consciousness. So if we can conceive of so-called zombies, then it's clear that consciousness is non-physical and thus presents a huge problem to materialists. So, what do you think of the validity of the zombie argument? Do you think zombies are conceivable, and do you think that's a big problem for the materials?
Boy, that is a hard question. I do think that they're conceivable, insofar as I think that you can sit down and like think of a being like that acts just like me, that is totally vapid, something that is like a robot, that is completely enacting everything that I'm enacting, but is totally empty inside and is just operating off of a pure mechanical um um uh functions. So I think that you can I think that you can conceive of them in that way. Um, but I do see like a difficulty in that, like, would it be possible, um, like Hillary Putnam's Twin Earth, where you are you familiar with that, with the water that's XYZ?
Yeah, 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 yeah. I am.
Yeah. So like
Mm,
seeing water, thing that looks exactly like water but is XYZ. Can I um conceive of that?
mm,
Sure. but isn't water just H2O? Like, aren't they identical? You know,
Yeah.
like, so um I can see how people would be upset about
Mm.
zombies and say, like, look, they're still identical. Just because you can conceive of this other thing doesn't mean that they're non-identical. Um,
It's a sort of metaphysical possibility, or just because it's
mhm.
conceivable doesn't mean that it's sort of possible, which sort of goes against
Yeah,
that identity, I guess.
yeah, and I see that objection, and I don't know what I think about it, like, because um I think that I thought that the objection was good until I started thinking about that Putnam uh um
Yeah.
yeah, counter example, and yeah, now I'm not so sure I buy the zombie argument anymore.
I think I sort of thought the same thing. At first I was like, oh, to me, it seems obvious that they're conceivable because
Mhm.
but does that really entail possibility? And I feel like it's hard to say that conceivability just inherently means possibility. I think that we can there are obviously like limits. Like for example, the example they love to use is like or proponents of the zombie argument. They say, for example, you can't conceive of a triangle that's not um like has three sides and 180 degrees, right?
Mhm.
And so that just shows, oh, conceivability must entail possibility because you can't conceive anything that's not um you can only conceive of things that are possible. And so that's sort of why I thought the zombie argument was successful. But if you really think about it, it's just, as you said, like that identity, like triangles are like that's what they are 180
Mhm.
degrees and three sides. And that's why you can't conceive of anything else than that. But on other things, there are a lot of things that we can conceive that are probably not possible in regards to physics or mathematics. And so I think that the zombie argument is sort of flawed in that way. It's sort of preying on our general intuition that certain things that like it preys on our intuition that conceivability um, means possibility, but that I feel like that's not exactly the case.
Yeah, maybe it's like we could say that it's nomologically impossible, though it's metaphysically possible, you know, and the nomological possibility is what's driving. Like, what we're really interested in is it the case that uh we have qualia, or not that we have qualia, but that we have minds that are separate from our bodies, not could we have minds that are separate from our bodies. Um so yeah, yeah, I think the zombie arguments, they're interesting. I think they still hold some interest because I think they still help you to see what qualia are. Like, when people are so like adamant that there are no such thing as qualia, you can pull out the zombie argument and say, well, can't you see that there's a difference between, like, a guy here and a guy here? Like, wouldn't that be a difference, you know? But I'm not sure that it proves what we wanted to prove, or what
Yeah,
somebody who would, yeah.
I think it's still very useful. I just don't think it fully like disproves physicalism. I just think that, as you said, it's useful to point out the idea of like minds or consciousness. So just following on this idea of consciousness, um, I'm not sure if you've heard of Jackson's knowledge argument and Mary's Broom's
Mhm.
thought experiment. So, for the viewers who are unfamiliar, that's the thought experiment that Mary is a colorblind scientist who learns everything there is to know physically about the color red, but never sees the color. And the question is, when Mary does Mary learn any new information when leaving the colorless room for the first time? And if your answer is yes, then that would mean that the world has something more than just the physical. So I'm quite convinced by this thought experiment, and I'd like to see what you sort of think of this thought experiment.
Yeah, I am too. And it's interesting because Frank Jackson is not convinced by it. And he's the
Yeah.
one who gave it at first. Um, but I I think that's just him being pigheaded about it, because uh I think when he looks at it, um, what he wants to say is that it is an argument about the way that we can represent something. Um, and I don't think that's at all what the point of it is. I think the point of it is that there is something new, right? Like that there are these things, experiences. Like that's the whole point, is like you can have all the knowledge you want, but then comes this new thing along. And isn't it a new thing because now she has this experience that she never had before, you know? Um, so I'm pretty convinced by it. Yeah. And he sounds like when he talks about it, he sounds like he's just following the party line. And I, no offense, Frank, but that's just that's what it sounds like to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I was quite surprised that he didn't like. He's not too much of a fan of that thought experiment or that line of argument, but I think it's very convincing. I think that if we really think about the thought experiment, it just seems like there is that noetic quality to sort of like experience, or that conscious
Mhm.
experience or something. And I just think that because of that, it really points to the idea that maybe the mind is not physical. And I think that that's a really big problem for the materialists.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think the color example is so interesting because you look at it and you say something like, okay, let's say that you see purple. Um, there's clearly some qualitative experience of purple, right? Like that's what Frank Jackson's argument shows. But you open up the brain, where is purple, right? Like there's nothing that's purple in the brain, you know? Like, so what are we talking about now? Right? There's got to be something that is not that neuron, or it may be caused by that neuron. You know, I'm not saying that it's not. It may emerge from that neuron, and sure, you know, but it's definitely not a purple neuron.
Definitely. I don't know if have you read Quieting Qualia by Daniel Dennett?
No.
So basically he gives this example of how for example you have this like scientist, or actually no, he gives a different example. You have like two coffee tasters. I don't remember exactly, but it's like if you keep tasting the same coffee um over several years, right? So you have
Oh
person
yes.
one and
Sorry.
person
Go
two.
ahead. Keep going.
Yeah. And they basically sort of give different accounts of why their taste of coffee changes. Um, and sort of how you don't know which coffee taster is telling, like, has an accurate account of their own experiences. So, what do you think of this kind of objection, like these memory objections to sort of consciousness or qualia?
Yeah. So I don't think it objects. I don't think it's any kind of objection against the fact that you have qualia. It's just an objection against the reliability of your reporting of the qualia. You know, I think it it's like the illusionists' objections to consciousness. You want to say, no, you're not having any qualia. That's just an illusion. Okay, great. But what is an illusion? An illusion is a qualitative experience. You know, that's just what it is. So you're just telling me that. And what's worse is an illusion is nothing but a qualitative experience. It's a qualitative experience that has no physical counterpart. So now you're telling me that I'm having something that has no physical counterpart. Uh, wow, that's a lot to admit. So I don't think it proves anything that he wants it to prove. You know, I think that it's way off the mark. Like what he's attempting to show is that it's unreliable in what it's reporting. Sure, that's fine, but it's still a qualitative experience.
Yeah, 100% agree. Like, there are properties that people attach to qualia, and I feel like those properties are very easy to sort of attack. For example, like the directness or etc. But I feel like even if you can deny, like even like philosophers will inevitably try to attribute certain qualities so that we get a better understanding of consciousness or qualia. But I feel like even if you deny some of those qualities, it doesn't mean that qualia doesn't exist. It still does, just because, as we've talked about at the start, like just consciousness is so apparent and evident. And so I feel like even those objections against the quality are, I mean, like the qualities or the properties of qualia are very unconvincing. Um,
Mhm.
so just going on to major theories, where do you stand on sort of general physicalism and general like dualism?
Mm. So I'm actually a hylomorphist. So I'm kind of like in between. I think that we are mind body composites. I think um, that everything is a matter form composite, and I believe that not because of philosophy of mind. I believe that because of different philosophical commitments I have in the problem of change and some other problems that come in philosophy of nature. And so I think everything is made of matter, the potential aspect of the thing, and form, the actualizing principle of the thing. And when it comes to people, we have an actualizing uh, principle that the actualizing principle causes you to be the way that you are. And so our actualizing principle causes us to be the kinds of things that can think and can have experiences. And that Aristotle called the soul. He also called the soul, like he called the soul the forms of any living thing. So like he would say that plants have souls. He didn't mean like they're going to heaven or anything like that. Like all he meant was that they're the kinds of forms that cause those things to be living beings. And that's all he meant. Um, so where do these forms come from is the big question then. And that I think is an interesting one. And I'm a little torn. I really like emergentism. Um, I find it very attractive. Um, I don't think I know people that find like a strong creationism of it, like the soul is just created as soon as a human life is created. Um, okay, that's okay, but I'm more attracted to the idea that it emerges, um, and I think the hylomorphist perspective gives you a leg up on like on a standard emergentist account, because you already have this thing form that exists in all things, and now all you're doing is you're saying this specific kind of form, yeah, this is the kind of form that does this, and so it's not like the your standard emergentist who says, okay, we have matter, 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 and then all of a sudden, bang, this random thing just shows up out of nowhere. Yeah. So that's sort of my perspective.
Yeah, I sort of agree. I think when I first looked into emergentism, I felt like it was a very like promising model of the mind. But if I thought about it more, like I feel like strong emergence in itself is sort of saying the opposite and sort of like leaves like physicalism sort of becomes sort of dualist, or at least it
Mm-hmm.
sort of turns into the point where it becomes not entirely physicalism, where like if you say that the higher level phenomena, you can't reduce that to the lower level phenomena, but somehow consciousness just emerges from the physical. um it just seems like you're sort of saying the physical is not like the lower level domain is not fully like physical. Does that
Mm-hmm.
make sense? It's like if you're just saying that consciousness emerges from lower level domains, that means you're sort of implying that maybe lower level domains aren't actually physical, because how can something emerge from something else without having that exact thing? And so also I'm not that familiar with your standpoint. So in terms of form, do you mean like do you think that because you say all things have form, is that in the sense where that form is can be both material and immaterial, or
It would be it would be an immaterial aspect of the thing.
mm,
So
okay.
for everything would have this material and immaterial aspect, and matter being uh the stuff that is being made to be a particular way, and form being the principle that's making the matter to be the way that it is. Because if you think about matter, like um, what color is matter? You know, what shape is it? You know, how strong is it? You know, when we think about matter, matter really is just pure potentiality. Like if we break it down into its most conceptually basic form. Um, and so it requires some kind of actualizing principle, and typically that form is not going to do anything special. You know, it's just going to make a rock into a rock, or whatever it does. But when we get into these higher levels of organization, we have this special things happening. And I think so. I think especially for me, it's also important to take account of all the the different scientific discoveries when it comes to like um uh brain damage, and what happens with when electrical stimuli are applied to the brain, and all these weird things that have happened and have shown that the brain does affect consciousness, and it does affect mental states, and so I think that for me, I look at us as mind body composites. Like we have to be both. um or I do think that we can survive death, personally. Like I think that the mind has the capacity to, but I don't think that it's naturally that way. I think that um if we think about like the way that we know things, it's always through our senses. It's always through like I don't believe in like innate ideas. I think that everything I know from the stuff that I perceive, and then I can abstract from those things to know like other things. um but yeah, I think naturally speaking that we would always be embodied creatures.
That idea of form sort of reminds me of panpsychism. So
Mm-hmm.
not exactly, but so I
Yeah.
also note in one of your videos on the mind body problem, you talk about how you're naturally a skeptic, which I am as well. And so you
Mm-hmm.
say that we shouldn't directly just look into souls or non-physical materials just because they have explanatory power. So what do you think on more, I guess, radical theories like panpsychism, where it for a lot of people it seems very impossible to wrap their heads around, and how like just everything has a certain degree of consciousness to it. So what do you think of, I guess, just panpsychism as a whole?
Yeah, I think for panpsychism, to me it seems like a Hail Mary play. Where, oh, I guess so it seems to me like a desperation play, I should say. um so it seems like um it makes sense, like as a um as an attempt, because if you're going to say that, look, with the hard problem we're getting nowhere, like this physical stuff, we haven't even begun to fathom some kind of explanation for how a physical thing could give rise to a mental thing. So how in the world are we going to get around this? Then it makes it's a clever idea to say, well, let's just say everything has consciousness, and then we're set. But it's the same kind of it's the same kind of play that somebody would have if they would say there's no such thing as material things, it's all mind. Like it's, if you were like a Berkeleyan idealist that just said, yeah, matter doesn't exist, it's just mind. Yeah, that solves the problem too, but it seems to me like saying that rocks have some kind of consciousness, I don't know, that seems like a pill to swallow that we don't need for some reason. Like um I mean, there are other objections too, but just on an intuitive level it seems like uh an unnecessary pill to swallow. I think I can't think off the top of my head of the objections though.
Yeah.
Like
Just to me, just adding on to your point of just intuitively it seems like a hard pill to swallow. I feel like, as you said, it's sort of like a Hail Mary play. Like it's like the god of gaps for consciousness.
Yes. Okay. You're
That's how.
way more familiar with terminology than I thought. Okay. Like the Hail Mary play.
Yeah, that's just how I feel. Like I feel like, oh, we have no idea how to solve the hard problem, or there are so many problems that we don't know how to solve. Okay, let's just say that everything is conscious. And going back to, as you said, about like objections, sort of that consciousness, it just seems kind of like, I feel like the biggest problem for panpsychism is the combination objection, where it's like, how can you have like small amounts of consciousness, add them up together, and then now you
Yes.
have like a much more conscious being that can like experience and feel. Like you're not going to put a bunch of rocks together, squish them up, and then suddenly have a very conscious mind. I feel like that is one of the biggest problems for panpsychism as well.
That's right. The combination problem. So consciousness is not a thing that gets added together, right? It's not a thing. It's like a unified, simple thing. It's not an additive. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I think it's taking the right approach. Like I think there needs to be, I guess, more radical approaches than physicalism and dualism. I feel like we've
Mhm.
sort of like exhausted some of those theories. I think there's still definitely more to say about those two, but I think that more radical thinking is sort of necessary. And I think sort of, um, I think just thinking in physicalism and dualism, just because that's just what's been the long-standing debate, I think is problematic. So I think panpsychism, taking that radical approach, is a good path, but I don't think it's the right theory. What do you think
Mhm.
of taking, I guess, more radical approaches?
Yeah. I mean, that's like why I'm a hylomorphist, is because I think it's like, I think dualism, as um uh has its drawbacks, too. Like you said, that we've taken it far, and we've seen some problems. Most notably the how does the soul combine with the body? Like how do the two work together? Um, so for me as a hylomorphist, I don't have that problem because the soul and the body are a high, are a unity. So I do think that there needs to be more radical, and that's why I do appreciate that in panpsychism, that sort of willingness to look beyond the standard stuff.
So we've been through a few sort of major and radical theories. So I just want to talk about one that I find really interesting, which is type identity theory. And I guess the main reason that it's lost popularity is due to multiple realizability. So I don't know if you're too familiar with these two topics. If you're not too familiar with multiple realizability, that's proposed by Hillary Putnam, where
Mhm.
it's essentially, you're familiar with type identity theory, correct?
Right.
And multiple realizability, or
Mhm.
okay. So just for the viewers then, sort of multiple type identity theory basically says that mental states are identical to brain states, and sort of the multiple realizability objection is saying, how can sort of mental states be physically realized in different systems in different ways? That sort of goes against type identity theory. I don't find that a very convincing objection. So would you say that's a sufficient argument against type identity theory, or is that, and do you think it's enough to refute the theory as a whole?
Uh, that is classically been held to be refuting the
Yeah.
theory. I started to take a peek at your paper, and I'm interested to hear more. So I do not hold that. I don't hold it very strongly. Let's say that.
Yeah, I personally just think that sort of multiple realizability is a very weak argument. I
Mhm.
think the biggest argument for everything, obviously, is the explanatory gap.
Explanatory
Um,
power. Oh, explanatory gap. Yeah.
yeah, the explanatory gap, where sort of there's just like no explanation to why um, mental states would be identical to brain states. I feel like
Hmm.
Sort of smart just talks about Occam's razor. I've seen your video on identity theory. It was actually very helpful in helping me write um, up the research paper. But
Good.
I just think that like that is not the greatest argument, as you say in the video as well, how sort of like it's sort of an inductive argument, and that you can't just say, oh, I think you give this example, I think it's of the swans, of how sort of you've always seen white swans, you can't just, and then you just assume that all swans are white. That's not actually the case. And I feel like that's the same with arguments using Occam's razor.
Hmm.
I feel like multiple realizability is not that great of an objection because um, sort of sure, you can say that octopuses feel the same kind of pain that us humans feel, right? But
Hmm.
is that truly the case? Like an octopus or animals can feel pain, sure, but is that the same sort of mental state that we feel? Like, for example, we have CF fibers, and maybe like octopus have like O fibers, right? But
Hmm.
what's to say that their mental states are not different as well? We can't just simply just equate both our pains to be the same sort of mental state. I feel like that's the first big objection to it. But also the
Hmm.
second one is like it's not that big of a problem because we can just rephrase type identity theory. Like mental states are identical to brain states within the same system. Um, like within each system, you have your own sort of like mental states and brain states, and those are identical.
Hmm.
And then in a different system, you can have the same thing. It's just it. I feel like it makes the type identity theory argument actually more powerful because you can just say that because now you're accounting for all animals. You can just say that like octopuses have O fibers, beavers have like B fibers, and like you can just keep going on and on. But I feel like that
Hmm.
is also partly why type identity theory is also bad because then you just have a ton of identities you need to sort of work out. And I feel like that is like as if you want to argue through Occam's razor, saying that type identity theory is good, right? Because it's simple.
Hmm.
If you have to posit so many different brain states and mental states and these identities, I feel like it overcomplicates it. It doesn't simplify anything. It just makes it more complicated, which goes against why people think type identity theory is a good theory in the first place. And so
Hmm.
um, I think for those reasons, multiple realizability is actually not the greatest argument. Um, but I still don't think type identity theory is the best argument either.
Yeah, that sounds good. Um, yeah, I that makes sense. I like the I like the strengthening of type identity theory with the by um by specifying
Hmm.
the relation. Um, you're right; it does complicate the relation, and that makes it a very cumbersome theory.
Yeah.
Um, but it avoids the objection. So yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah. I just feel like it's like it just doesn't make sense to say that, oh, both an octopus and a human feel the same type of pain, you know? Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
like you like that's the argument that Putnam's sort of trying to say. Like, oh,
Hmm.
us and octopuses both feel pain, but the like it's not the same type of pain, just as it's not the same type of brain state.
Hmm.
That's the way I see it. But I also think that overcomplicates it. And so I think type identity theory doesn't really fall to the multiple realizability objection, but rather the explanatory gap, which I think for a lot of theories is the case as well, or sort of the explanatory power. Um,
Yeah, that would take out a lot of theories.
yeah, yeah. So I know we've talked about a ton of theories so far, and I just want to ask you if you think that the mind body problem can be solvable, and if we should even try to solve it in the first place.
That's a good question. I don't think this is one that um if we approach it from the perspective of the world is purely material, and then either how does consciousness arise, how does consciousness show up, or the world is purely material, and then let's prove that there's this non-physical thing. I don't think that if we approach it that way, then we're going to solve it. And yeah, I think we need to do philosophy of nature first. I think that like we have to really get into what are things made of and first, and then pursue the philosophy of mind and see like but ultimately I think we're gonna come up against some kind of fence, you know, like there's gonna be something we won't be able to explain, you know. I just I don't see how we will be able, we don't have access to everything, you know, like we have a limited access to our own consciousness. You know, we can reflect on it, but um as so many, you know, great experiments have shown that we have like um we think that we know what our consciousness is like, and then there's these bizarre ideas like that. Are you familiar with the Libet's experiments on like had a skull open, and he would say he would basically like view when an electric impulse would come from your brain and when you would raise your hand, and then um when you decided to raise your hand, like you would say when you decided to raise your hand, and the the impulse started before you had decided to
Oh
raise your
yeah,
hand.
I've heard of this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, I
that's
mean,
that's very weird for me because
yeah.
I don't know how to like. On that note, just a slight tangent. With like, what do you think that says about the idea of, sort of free will? Because if that impulse is before, you consciously think of that action, like, what do you think that tells us about free will?
Yeah.
Like, what implications do you think that has on consciousness?
I first of all, I don't know that I believe that that the timing is all legit. Like I know that there have been like I know that it has really been uh gone over with a fine tooth comb, but I still find it hard to believe that the reporting that you do on what you saw would coincide with exactly when your consciousness came in about. But I think that um, even if it were, that shows me that your conscious decision may be may start off as an unconscious decision, and then you have the conscious veto, which is what Libet said too. Which is what he showed. He showed that people would be about to, like, that impulse would start, and then they would decide, no, I'm not going to do it, and then they would be able to dampen the impulse, and then they wouldn't raise their hand. So I think at the very least we would have free will in the veto. Um, but yeah, I think that it shows me that we have free will insofar as you know, I think it makes sense out of like it seems like we have decisions that we make that are based on our character, you know. Like you let's say you drink all the time, then you're an alcoholic, and then you just start making decisions like an alcoholic would drink. But then you also could stop, you know. You also have the ability to stop. So I think maybe those decisions are just automatic decisions, and that ability to stop is a free will decision. I don't know. um I'm not totally sure. My free will, I'm like so on free will. Like I'm not that I mean I believe in free will, but like my philosophy of free will is just not that great.
Yeah,
I just
yeah.
haven't studied it well enough.
Yeah, I see that as well. I think what you're saying actually makes a lot of sense, just because like we maybe biologically innately have certain, like, I don't know, desires or just like impulses that will make us do stuff. But for example, our conscious like free will can come and interject in that just like natural impulse, for example.
Mhm.
And I think, yeah, I've had a lot of I wasn't sure about what you were when you first brought up the experiment, but I've definitely come across it. And I remember when I first came across that, I was like, that I thought that was such like a detrimental argument to free will.
Yeah.
But by the way that you put it, I think it makes a lot of sense of how like maybe it's that we maybe not consciously, but like I guess subconsciously or some impulse is first triggered and then we have the decision to act on that impulse. And so
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
I think and going back to as you say like with the alcoholic like you might have like that sort of I guess natural like inclination to drink, right? But you can't
Yeah.
make the conscious decision to stop it, which I think makes a lot of sense in terms of like both psychology and like science, but also just generally how we work within the world. That's actually very interesting.
I like the way you put it because it's not just the veto then. It's that you have the impulse and then you have the veto, the choice, or the choice to keep going.
Mm,
So you're not just choosing to veto, you're also choosing to let it go,
yeah,
and keep going. Yeah, I like that. That's good.
I think that a lot of these like for example this experiment is scientific, so I just have that question which pertains to both philosophy of mind but also the rest of philosophy as a whole. Like where do you think science fits in within philosophy, and what role do
Mhm.
you think science can play within philosophy in terms of philosophy of mind or just philosophy in general, but also what role do you think that philosophy plays within science as well?
Yeah, in philosophy of mind, it's interesting because you have so many people that um, in their books will just go off on science and just tell you all this stuff that is just totally inane. And um, you're like, okay, great. But what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Like that doesn't, that you can show me all you want what the brain is doing when we are conscious. My question is, where does the consciousness come from, right? And you still don't
Yeah,
have you consciousness is still an unobservable thing, so you can't do science on an unobservable thing. And so I think that there are some clever experiments like the one that we just talked about, um that give us data that we have to deal with, but I think that very few of them end up being that important,
mm,
like I think that so many of them end up being um just more grist for the mill that make people sound like it ends up like sounding like, hey, I've got all this support on my side because I know all this science. And you're like, no, like you're just giving me a bunch of facts
yeah,
that don't have anything to do with what we're talking about.
100%.
um
Yeah. Like I think I think there are three things pertaining to this. I think the first one is that sort of like as you said, science is just giving us the facts and sort of like
mhm,
can tell me what's going on in the brain, but that doesn't tell me where consciousness comes from. And I feel like it's that like science, I feel like is more of the study of like what is going on and like how can we predict certain things or what can we expect. And I feel like that's problematic in terms of consciousness because we're trying to find out where consciousness comes from but also what consciousness is exactly.
mhm.
And so I think science is unable to like I think the facts are useful and they're something we definitely have to deal with, but it doesn't sort of like get to the root of what we're trying to find. And I think that also goes back to another idea of how sort of how I think we as philosophers see the mind or consciousness is sometimes very different to how sort of neuroscientists or scientists think of the mind and consciousness when they're trying to study it scientifically, which I think also
Mhm.
goes back to the idea of these two don't really like reconcile with one another. I do think that science and philosophy definitely play like a sort of symbiotic, have a sort of symbiotic relationship with one another, though. How like I think something that I was thinking about, like this isn't a very thought out theory, but in terms of I guess things like quantum physics, like wave particle duality, sort of how things can like I think that can extend to philosophy. I think like we can think
Mhm.
okay, maybe things are also like a dual nature. Like maybe there's like as you like matter and form, or like panpsychism, like there's consciousness and then there's the material. I think that like maybe there's a duality in the particles. Like maybe consciousness is that like fundamental thing that we haven't found yet, or something along those lines. I'm not exactly sure, but I just think that there even though science is this like the objective study and sort of consciousness is like that subjective thing, I don't think that like the way that we're approaching it now and the way that it's being approached is problematic, but I don't think that that means that science doesn't have a role to play.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it gives us the um the fodder for which to do philosophy, without which, I mean, we we already require the regular world, the real world, and our access to the real world, I think to do philosophy. And then this is just giving us more of it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
So just on this note of sort of philosophy as a whole, what do you personally constitute as philosophical progress? And do you think that's different to sort of scientific progress? Like Chalmers sees it
Oh
as
yeah.
the convergence of truth. Do you think that's what progress and success is within philosophy, or do you think differently?
Yeah. I yes and no. Um, I think that a lot of times through you get errors, and the errors propagate the ideas forward. Just like you learn what you don't believe from learning, you learn what you do believe from learning what you don't believe, like you see like a bunch of stuff and you're like, that's got to be wrong. And well, why does it got to be wrong? And then you have to like figure it out. um so I think that's part of it, but I think he's probably right. Like, I'm definitely not a guy that just thinks, hey, we're here just to study a bunch of theories. I think we're here to figure out what is the world really like, and whatever that is, if we're getting closer to that, I think that is progress in philosophy.
That's a really interesting take on it. I've never thought of it like that. Yeah. Hmm. Because I always way like I thought of philosophy, like I was thinking about this question a few months ago, and I was like,
Mhm.
maybe it's not the convergence on truth, but more or like not success. I think success is the convergence on truth, but I think the philosophical progress is sort of the divergence of ideas. I did a TEDx talk actually a few months ago. It's
Oh,
not
cool.
uploaded online, but it will be in like a month or so, where I talk about sort of embracing ambiguity, where I feel like um with philosophical progress, how I see it is like the like as you said, having a bunch of theories, but then seeing the ones that you don't agree with and the ones that you agree with, and then from there you can keep going. But I think the fundamental basis is the like multitudes of possible like theories or truths that you can posit, and then like you need that basis of all the ideas, which is why I think looking into radical theories is important, because you need to look
Mm.
at everything, not just like materialism and dualism, because that doesn't give us like all the answers and all the things that we need to resolve. Like looking at the entire like sides, like everything in between materialism to dualism and everything beyond, like all
Mhm.
like the divergence from truth will like synthesize eventually into the convergence of truth. But I don't think that for philosophy of mind, more specifically, we have done enough divergence. That's
Yeah,
what I see.
I like that. Yeah, I because I do think, first of all, it's just fun to say, what could it be,
Yeah.
like, even if it's not this way, what was possible. um but at the same time, I think that it is important to look at everything that is possible, and um in order to understand. I don't know, Plato thought that you had to know everything. You had to know, like, to know one thing, you had to know everything it was not, and there might be something to that, to know the way the world is, you have to know the way it's not. And then that sort of shedding of the errors is what we gets us down to the right thing. I don't know.